You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Coaching Inn. I'm your host Claire Pedrick, and today's guest is Mary Ellen MacDonald, who we're going to meet in a moment. Just a reminder, subscribe or follow if you want to receive every episode as it drops. So you will have heard lots of podcasts that we've done about about dying and about end of life. So when I met Mary Ellen MacDonald, who talks about grief, I thought we need to have Canada's answer to Catherine Mannix. Come to the Coaching Inn. Welcome, Mary Ellen.
that's a high bar.
Yeah, I don't think it's. I think you've overcome the high bar. So, Mary Ellen, tell us a bit about your journey into the work.
Yeah. I never ever know how to answer this question. So I've been working in and around palliative care for like 2 decades. And I originally started just as a solid researcher with an opportunity to think about pediatric palliative care back in early 2000s. And my job at that point was really to help create a research program around pediatric palliative care in Montreal. I was in Montreal at that time. And it was a big ask for someone who didn't know much about death, dying, loss, but I was also just kind of a young academic. It's like, oh, I can do that. Let's try to do that. So I went into it eyes wide open. Sometimes those eyes would cry because of the kind of intensity of the topic, but also as a researcher, already at that point, it was interesting to me. So it was that emotional piece where I would literally cry, but also that kind of engage the brain piece where it's like, this is interesting. As my training is as an anthropologist. So, I see the world through this anthropological lens, and I could see the world of pediatric palliative care through this lens and think, wow, there's so much going on here that is just not out there in the literature. It just has not been really kind of explored and understood and written about in the literature. So that was my entry point. But what really, really stuck with me from that work and has stuck with me to this day is like, I was in a clinical setting. I was focused in a clinical setting. But what really stayed with me was the families who left that clinical setting and went out into the world with their experience. And so these families, specifically, their child had died in the hospital where, they were patient and family, and it was all this clinical stuff, important, really important. And then they left the institution. The hospital went on with the next patient, with the next family, with the next child. The family went back to their world that had irrevocably changed, completely changed, because now the child had died in that institution, and they had to somehow learn to inhabit a new life, or the old life that they had to evolve, had to change. And meanwhile, the neighbor didn't know what to say. The employer didn't know what to say. People just avoided them. And it's not like I don't want to criticize those people. We understand why, as a neighbor, you just don't have the tools to feel like you can be helpful. You also, there's this thing about death and loss that it's almost like it's contagious. Like if you go too close to that family, what about your child? Like you just don't want to have to imagine. And so you don't, right? And so it was that piece that just stayed with me, trying to think as an anthropologist, what is going on here? But also as someone who was working in applied health research, what are we going to do about it? Right? So it's that double piece of understanding it, but then having this kind of commitment to this is not okay. This is worse. Like, yes, they have gone through all of this, but now they're living a life that is making it worse than it needs to be. It's awful, and we're not going to fix that. But it doesn't have to be that bad and getting worse. Right. So that was my entry point.
Wow. So many interesting things there, because you're talking, I think, about a lack of education or a lack of insight or a lack of knowing what to do, which of course from the neighbour employer's perspective also gets worse and worse, isn't it? Because the longer you don't say anything, the harder it is to say anything at all.
Yes. Yeah. So then, I mean, that's the first rule of running a focus group, right? The longer people go without talking, the longer people go without talking.
Ah, yeah.
Right? Like that's the first rule when you're convening, a social conversation, get people talking. Because if they jump in and they hear their own voice, they develop a new comfort with what's going on. But if you don't, which is why, when you're running a focus group, you go around the room. Okay, everyone say their name and what brought them here, or what do you think of when you hear the word grief? What do you think of? And you say something, and then you feel like you belong and that you have something valuable to say and that you have a fluency in the topic. But thank you, Claire, because I'd never thought of that before.
I don't know if you've heard of Nancy Klein. She wrote a book called Time to Think. And she says, oh, you have to read it. She says people don't arrive until they've spoken, which is exactly what you've just said. But in the context of what you're talking about, Mary Ellen, there's something for me about people don't connect until they've spoken. And the longer they haven't spoken, the less connected they are.
Yes, I completely agree with you there. And I think with specifically around death, dying, and loss, people are so afraid they're going to say the wrong thing, which, that's a good reaction. That's a good reaction. I don't want to make this worse, so I'm going to shut up, without understanding that that is worse. It is worse to not say anything. I mean, sure, you don't want to say the wrong thing, which is where we then come in with, okay, be humble and ask for a little bit of help. Like, look, I really don't know what to say. Can you help me here? Or, this is what I'm feeling. I don't want to burden you with what I'm thinking. Help me here because I want to show up for you.
Which is connecting.
Yeah, it's all connecting. Yes, completely.
So in this journey that you've taken, your journey into changing your bit of the world, I loved your TED Talk, by the way. We'll put the link in the show notes.
Thank you.
What are the wins? What have you noticed is slowly changing in the world as you try and be more explicit about this need for conversations?
Right. So in 2018, I was with a group of international scholars. We're part of this group called the International Work Group on Death, Dying, Bereavement. And it's like the best kept secret there is in the field because no one's heard of it. And yet the people who are in it are just so incredibly passionate about it. But it's a closed group. Like it is a work group. But a work group of 100 people. But that work group then splits off into subsections. And I was working with a subsection in 2018 on public health and grief, like specifically taking that frame to grief. And we had a week together in Canada. We were meeting in Canada at that time. And we had a week together, I think there were 6 or 7 of us, to sit and think about public health and grief. And out of that week, we came up with this concept called grief literacy. Now, the actual word did exist buried in a graduate thesis in New Zealand or something like that at the time, but we could not, there was health literacy and there was even death literacy at that point. But no one had actually put their finger on grief literacy. And so we worked together to kind of carve that out. We then published it in 2020. And so we were the first, we're the first, get it out there into the academic world, whatever that means. Like the academic world published it, and we published it in Death Studies, which, very niche. And the concept of grief literacy then got legs during the pandemic.
Yes, of course.
And at least in Canada, and I would say in the United States too, it has exploded.
Yeah.
So it's not being linked necessarily back to our group, which is fine. Like, it was one of those things, put it out into the world and just let it go, because the whole world needs this idea. And it is coming back around in ways that we had even dream. It is showing up in community organizations. It's showing up in bereaved family organizations. It's showing up in hospice organizations. Everyone in those worlds right now is using, and I do mean everyone is using, this idea of grief literacy. And some are coming back to our original definition, and some are carving it out and tailoring it for what they need it to be, which is perfect. Because with grief and grief education and grief training, it always, always, always needs to be tailored to context, to culture, to the specificity of the loss, to who's doing the kind of leading and who's doing the receiving and all those conversations. It has to be tailored. So we are just, tickled pink about this idea that people are picking this up and making it their own and having the conversations. They're really doing the training, small groups, larger groups, conferences. There's whole conferences on grief literacy now, which is just amazing. So yeah, we've really seen it grow in wonderful ways.
What an amazing thing to have been part of that nobody knows about.
Yeah.
Do you have a little happy stance inside every time you see the words?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, at first it was a little bit of, wait a minute, that's ours. And then it's no, it's not. It was never ours. It was an opportunity to just work and think, and the spirit of grief literacy is, it's not ours, and it can't be. There was one organization we noted early on that had tried to trademark something around this, and it's no, you can't. I mean, first of all, you can't literally, because it's just some words that you put together, right? You could trademark a training program or something, but not the phrase. And that's not the spirit of it anyway.
Mm. So most of our listeners around the world are in some way or other engaged in conversations. So are there a few tips that you might offer them in terms of grief literacy in conversation?
Ah, lovely. Yeah, when I think of myself wanting to be grief literate, I think of myself first and foremost as a citizen.
Yeah.
I'm not a professional. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not an educator. I am a citizen. And as a citizen, wanting my society to be kind and compassionate, I need to know how to show up for these conversations.
Mm.
So with my neighbor, with the clerk in the grocery store, like I literally walked into a dry cleaner and was somehow chatting with the clerk who was taking my clothing. And we were talking about, I don't even know, like I just started chatting with people and we were talking about singing or something. And it turned out this gentleman was part of a choir that was showing up or had just shown up for a choir member's funeral. And everywhere you go, you can find loss. If you listen for it, you'll find it every day. So to know how to then show up for this gentleman and listen to the story and open a space, it took 5 minutes out of my day, but we connected.
Mm-hmm.
At least in my heart, I feel we connected. And, things like asking the name of the person who died, like the friend of his, and what song did they sing and why did they choose that song? Like we weren't talking dry cleaning at all. We just had this moment. My day was better. I hope his day was better. I walked out of there feeling like I just connected and I learned this beautiful story about, So it's showing up as citizens with knowledge about, well, what is this grief thing anyway? Right? It's like we all know, okay, when someone dies, you could grieve. But it's all that the hidden grief that we don't talk about. Some of it is like the stigmatized kinds of death. Some of it is the stigmatized issues like around miscarriage and abortion. Some of it is just areas of life that we don't label as grief. So like grief in retirement would be an example. All the kinds of loss that happen to us just because we're human that we don't necessarily label as grief. So knowing the obvious grief, but also where grief can be hidden is really important. And then with that knowledge, what are your skills? What's your skill set? Right. So what do you do with that knowledge? How do you have those safe conversations? How do you open space in the grocery store or the library or in your workplace that is, respectful and humble? Don't want to talk about it now? That's fine. I just want to convey that I'm a person that if you do want to talk about it, knock on my door, right? Or next time you see me. And that just happened to me. Again, it was in a store. I walked into the store and I saw the woman behind the desk and I looked and I went, oh, the dog you usually have in this store is not here. Where's your dog? Pause. Awkward silence. And she's like, he's not with us anymore. So hear that. Pause. Don't make it about you, right? Like that's, oh, I lost my dog too. Or, or that's too bad. You could get another dog. Or, oh, well, that was just like whatever. Just pause. And I said something and it was clear she just didn't want to go there. And because she was going to start to cry. The dog had died 2 weeks prior and she was just going to like, nope, I'm going to get through my day today. Don't want to talk about the dog. Silence. So I went around the store, did whatever I was doing in the store, and just came within earshot of her. And she just opened up. She just opened up and told me what happened to the dog, how she's feeling about not having the dog. Like, she needed to talk about the dog, but she also needed to assess that I was going to be able to receive what she had to say, and that I wasn't just another person in the store who was going to then make it about me or leave the store in the middle of the conversation or say, how much does this, how much do these shoes cost? And again, right, like, this is just me being a shopper. It wasn't me being an educator. It wasn't me being, right? So it's that knowledge, it's the skills, and in grief literacy, we say it's also your attitude. Like, I want a world that's more compassionate. Like, I want that. That's my value. So that motivates me to show up in ways and try. Like, we're fallible.
And having a few words, I notice that you can use that are going to be that are going to begin being how you want to be. So I often say to people, I'm guessing there are some feelings about that.
It's a great,
which is different from how are you feeling, which is often the last. They want to go, how do you think I'm feeling?
Yeah, that
Sadly,
is.
we've had a lot of loss around us over the last few years, and learning how to be normal in a way that people can talk or not talk as they wish. So I like to say, how's your day?
Yeah.
Because how's your day is a contained question.
Yeah.
And actually, if today was okay, then today was okay. And if it wasn't okay, that's also great. Fine. Not a problem. But just being a bit more asking something that is safe enough, as you said. That lady had 2 goes at safety with you, didn't she?
Yeah, that I really like that. Yeah, how was your day? Yeah, because some days, it's good, right? Some days, and that's great. Some days aren't good. Again, that just is, right? So that then gives you some clues where to go. Yeah. Yeah.
So what's your hope for the world? Let's go small, shall we, here?
What's my hope for the world? Well, I guess, one day at a time, but we really are trying in our little corner of Canada, are trying to get this not just on the radar, because I feel like it's on the radar. And, thanks to the pandemic for that, to keep it on the radar. To keep it on the radar, so that we can get it, we can infiltrate everything. It needs to be in daycares. It needs to be in elementary schools. It needs to be in high schools. It needs to be in all faith-based organizations. It needs to be in all employee, situations and trainings. And it needs to be bottom up. It needs to be top down, and it needs to be smack in the middle. Like, you can't be heavy-handed about this if you don't have, a population or a workforce that values it and understands it, and also feels like they're going to be supported in it and not more stigmatized or more excluded. So it has to then be bottom up, so that you have scenarios like in a workplace where your colleagues, it's not just your manager, but your colleagues are grief literate, and they know how to show up for you. So it's not just like you get isolated and brought into the manager's office and have your little chat, but actually your colleagues in the lunchroom, or, they see you crying at your desk and they're not awkward about it. They're just like, do you want some time? Or, do you want to go for a walk later? Or, right. So that it's normal. It's not just normal, but it's social. So it's that combination of, we're not just like wanting to normalize it, that you might cry at work, but that it's in us, our social spaces where it's so that would be kind of my dream for taking over the world with this. And we're really, I'm in a small part of Canada, which is lovely because it gives a certain facility for hitting all the borders. And like kind of Nova Scotia, where I am, is a small, like physically, geographically, a small province, which means we have a facility to get to like across the province with kind of messaging and with activity and with building community. And there's also a pride about kind of being here. So, and that we have already seen that energy and excitement spill over into other provinces. Like,
Wow.
yeah, spill across borders and then move across the country a little bit. So that has been absolutely lovely.
So if I come to Nova Scotia, when I come to Nova Scotia, what will I see? What might I see and go, that needs to move over the pond?
Lovely. So 2 years now running, in September, the end of September, we have run what we kind of tagline in our head as a festival, a grief festival. Now, there's lots of people who are grieving who don't want a festival. And I get that, right? Festival sounds cheery and you're going to have balloons and maybe popcorn. Like, no, no. At the same time, we kind of feel like, well, all these other kinds of activities and phenomena get to have festivals, like a culture festival and a jazz festival and a theater festival. It's like, well, grief needs a festival too. We deserve a festival. So this is our second year running it. It just closed, and this year we called it Grief Gatherings.
Oh.
So this idea is more intimate than a festival, like gathering. So let's gather people together who want to learn about grief, who are grieving themselves, who are, just curious about this thing. Let's gather them. And we run it as a crowdsourced activity. So we open it to any community organization that will kind of meet our basic criteria. Like, it has to be about grief literacy. It has to be open and accessible and as free as it possibly could be. We have a little bit of money that we can help rent a church hall. We can help pay for, coffee and cookies sort of thing. Like, it's not big budget stuff. It doesn't have to be. And we've just kind of spread this notion under this banner. So our organization is called Grief Matters. So people can look it up, griefmatters.ca, CA for Canada, because we like to brand things. And so Grief Matters is running, or has, run for 2 years now, this grief gatherings activity at the end of September. This year, we had 36 events, and they were all crowdsourced. So
Wow.
from hospice organizations to a veterinary clinic that would put on a activity where you could create memorials for your pet. We had a number of activities, walking activities. So like, there's an organization called Hike Nova Scotia that wanted to get on board and have activities for older adults who are grieving, who, might not be great hikers, but they certainly like to walk. And so activities where you could come together with other people who are going through something similar to what you're going through, and just walk through the woods or walk through the park together, like these kinds of things. And so it's very much this model of crowdsourcing, using grief literacy as the framework. And as I said earlier, grief literacy has to be tailored to your community, to your needs. So if your people like to walk, let's organize a walk. If your people need to memorialize a pet, let's facilitate that. Some more kind of on the religious sides, much more on the secular side, and right across the province, there were lots of in-person activities, but lots of online activities. And as I said, we spilled over into other provinces. So there were activities happening in New Brunswick. There was an online activity out of Quebec. There was a conference in Ontario, 2 conferences in Ontario, and then a person in British Columbia, like all the way on the other side, offers some activities for sibling loss. And she had some online activities, including a walk. You could have an online walk. So you get together online and you kind of orient yourself, and then you go out on your own walk with some kind of reflective questions, and then you come back and join everyone at the end again. So it's still building community, but it's like being facilitated for people who want to access it online. So
Wow.
absolutely lovely. And just the kind of the evaluation, the feedback from people is like, we just need more of this. We need more of this.
And I love that as you were going through those things, you were normalizing a whole lot of different kinds of loss. And I'm sure you didn't talk about all of them, the ones that were honoured or recognised, or naming things matters, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it's interesting. You could have, I talked to one host, one of the people who hosted an event yesterday, and he said that they run this thing that they call a comfort tea. So it's not a death cafe, it's not a grief cafe, it's a comfort tea. Because in their community, that brings people in ways that naming it as death or grief might not.
Ah.
And it's having a cup of tea. And that's a lovely thing. So, but he said everyone who came with a death loss. Like they kind of came, hi, my name is so-and-so, and, my mother died. At the same time, he made sure people felt they had the permission to talk about other kinds of loss. And he was really kind of amazed at the breadth, retirement issues, and kind of aging bodies, and how aging bodies change the way you can show up at work. Those kind of issues came out in the conversation. But people still thought, okay, I can only go if I actually have a death loss, right? Even though it wasn't on the poster, but people still kind of have that assumption. So that's part of this education too, is like helping people language other things that are going on in their life also as grief and loss.
Wow. So if you were going to give our listeners one gift as we come to a close today, Mary Ellen, what would the gift be?
Ooh, a gift. I really feel like a huge gift you can give yourself and give other people is languaging grief, like bringing language forward to name things as grief. It's validating for your own feelings. Like grief shows up in anger, it shows up as fear, it shows up as a stomach ache, it shows up as a crick in the neck, it shows up as lack of motivation, as like hyperactivity. It shows up in so many ways in our bodies, and then that trickles out because we just yelled at our neighbor or child or something, or we're just cranky. Like, so like a huge gift is understanding what grief is, and then having that compassion for yourself. Like, oh, that's why Monday was such a crappy day, because it was actually the anniversary of, Yeah.
Thank you. And of course, naming it as an offer, grief, loss, rather than naming it as a statement or a diagnosis.
100%.
Always the offer.
100%.
So you've given us your website, griefmatters.ca for Canada, and I'll put Mary Ellen's TED Talk in the show notes.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation.
And thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back next week. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching Inn, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.